Turn in your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 5. As I mentioned before, if we were to go back and with greater time and perhaps insight into things, we would have chapter divisions be differently. And so, for me, this would become chapter 5, right here at verse 14. Because prior to that, we were dealing with the sin offering. And I wish I could be that dogmatic, and yet you're going to see a little bit here that there is a lot of overlap between the sin offering and the trespass offering. So much so that some people have wondered, is this really the same offering with different conditions behind it? Now, I believe that I can say before you today, without a moment of doubt, without a moment of hesitation, they're different offerings. And I will tell you why as we get into the study. But I will also tell you that, there's a lot of similarity, and perhaps they're dealing with, and I'll read you Bonar's comments, he's the only person out of all the commentaries that I have on the book of Leviticus that I was able to look at, and I looked at about 7. He was the only one that wagered a reason why perhaps they're similar and yet different. And so it takes the oldest guy out of the commentaries that I have to have an opinion on that. But anyways, brief review of the sacrifices. There are 5. I know when we would look at the book of Leviticus, and I would say, how many, if I'd asked you this question before I held my hand up saying 5, are there more than 10 or less than 10? I bet you most people would think there's more than 10, because the whole thing is just full of all these different sacrifices we don't completely understand, and it's all loads of confusion and all that stuff. But I can tell you right now, this is the 5th and final sacrifice. So there's only 5. There's only 5 different sacrifices. Now, the rest of Leviticus is dealing with the application of that and occasions for that and all those other elements. But at this point here, from I'll call it a foundational perspective, you got 5 sacrifices. Now, the first one, Leviticus chapter 1, is the burnt offering or the whole offering. I could go through a lot of things, but just remember, the biggest thing of this one was the whole thing got consumed. And what did it picture? It really pictured the atoning sacrifice of Christ. All right? It pictured that very, very much. Everything was poured out on that one. Nothing was preserved except for what? The hide. And that went to the priest. But everything else was basically taken and it was burned up. Then there was the grain offering. Now the grain offering, Leviticus chapter 2, very, very similar to our tithes and offerings. It was given to the priest. A portion was given to the Lord. It was burned up, but the rest was kept by the priest to actually provide for their needs. And so again, I would liken that very much to our tithes and offerings. Very, very similar. Number 3, the peace offering, Leviticus chapter 3. The peace offering was really showing the peace between the two parties, really God and man. And the notable thing about the peace offering was that the person making the peace offering actually consumed of a portion of that sacrifice itself. It was the fat and all the other parts were given to the Lord. But the rest of it, he had a meal. And it was showing the fact that peace existed between him and God. And again, do we have a New Testament likeness? In my opinion, absolutely, the Lord's table. Very, very much similar. There's a peace between God and man. All those who are partakers of that sacrifice and what he accomplished have peace with God. Number 4 is the sin offering, and I'm going to use another word in there. Gordon Wenham likes to call it the purification offering. If we were to pause for a moment about that, I think he's got a point on the purification offering, and the reason is taking into account, for example, a woman giving childbirth obviously not sinful, and yet purification. It's really the outcomes of sin is what it is. But it was always dealing with this. It was a sin that was committed publicly, and yet it was a sin that was not known by the person that when they did it. Or then we get into chapter 5 where it's not really something where the person sinned. They didn't break the law of God. They're just a sinner. And that's what I kind of got into the aspect of that exceeding sinfulness of sin. And so this was really about purification from the sin and the effect of sin on our lives. And that was and that was from chapter 4 all the way through chapter 5 and verse 13. So that's where our chapter break ought to be, right after verse 13. All right, lastly, trespass offering. Now I'm going to give you another name for that one. A reparation offering. Reparation offering. And that's going to go from Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 14. And once you know it, it goes to chapter 6 and verse 7. So you see, once you get those chapter divisions off, it's hard to get back on track again. But it goes all the way to chapter 6 and verse 7, is all about the reparation offering. Now, what was really, really interesting is that you take chapter 5, verse 14, and it's kind of all the way through the end of chapter 5, and it's kind of giving you the basis of this offering, this trespass offering. And then in chapter 6, it gives you like occasions and applications of it. You know what that reminded me of? The sin offering. You remember in chapter 4, the sin offering went all the way through in chapter 4 up towards like the last number of verses, kind of talking about the sin of the priest, the sin of a ruler, the sin of different party involved, and then it goes through all these other examples of it, of a sin offering in chapter 5, even the very beginning. So from that way, that was another similarity between the sin offering and the trespass offering, that there was this even similarity in how the instruction was given. It was very, very formal up front, and then very, very practical on the back end. Now, when the Jews would refer to this book, if you look at chapter 5, verse 14, it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses." In the Jewish Bible, they would not have originally called this the book of Leviticus. They would have called this, "And the Lord spoke to Moses." And that was the name of this book. And you can find that those words as being very much like headers in different things as it goes through the book. Again and again and again, the Lord spoke to Moses. So he says, if a person commits a trespass and sins unintentionally in regard to the holy things of the Lord. So, number one, it says they commits a trespass. We're going to get into that word trespass. And sins unintentionally. What does sins unintentionally remind you of? Reminding me of the sin offering. So again, the similarities there are real. But now it goes on. Application. In regard to the holy things of the Lord. Then he shall bring to the Lord as his trespass offering a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation in shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, as a trespass offering. So, the language in Leviticus 5, verse 14, starts off similar but a little different than the sin offering. Down in verse 17. If a person sins and commits any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he does not know it. Again, very similar to that of the sin offering. It says, yet he is guilty and shall bear his iniquity. And I mentioned before, the similarities go on. If you look at chapter 6, the first 7 verses, compare that against chapter 5, the first 12, 13 verses, you are going to find very similar, after that chapter division for us, there's a lot of similarity here. The word commits a trespass. So, in verse 14, if a person commits a trespass. I'm going to give you a literal Hebrew rendering. A person trespasses a trespass. That's literally what it's going to mean in Hebrew. They trespass a trespass. And it seems to refer to what? So let's think about it. Have you ever trespassed before on property? I remember as a kid, we had this farm. So I grew up in a suburb of Detroit. But it's kind of like where we live in Lake in the Hills. It was like, you didn't go that far out, and you had a lot of rural area. Well, there was this guy, and he was known. He had a lot of property, but he was known for keeping a shotgun loaded with rock salt. And so it was kind of like a badge of honor that you got on his property and did something, whatever, and you didn't get shot. And so, of course, I was a stupid kid. And I remember being out there, and I remember the guy shouting. And I ran for like 3 seconds, and then I dove. Boom, hit the ground. I heard the kaboom with a shotgun going off. Then I jumped up. I started running again. Another 5 seconds, and I hit the ground again. Boom! Shotgun goes off again. That's the closest I ever got. Scared me to death. I never went back again. I didn't know if the guy was shooting rock salt or shooting buckshot, for that matter. And so I was like, all right, this is stupid. But I committed a trespass. All right, I was on somebody else's property. I wasn't supposed to be there, and as a result of that, there were repercussions. I broke a law. Be honest, at that time, too stupid as a kid to understand that. But I broke a law. That's what this is. This is ramifications of overstepping a boundary. Now, we're going to get to some practical things with it. But at a high level, that's what this is. This is referred to as a trespass offering. This is referred to by Gordon Wenham as a reparation offering. I want to give you one more word for it. Guilt offering. Guilt offering. Because the word for trespass in the word trespass offering, those two words combined, is the Hebrew word asam, which means guilt. It also means restitution. Hence, Gordon Wenham in his reparation. So you might want to add a fourth one called a restitution offering. It's a gift of atonement. It's a compensation. And so Leviticus chapter 14 and verse 13. Then he shall kill the lamb in the place where he kills the sin offering and the burnt offering. So what are you hearing here? Well, he's killing a ram. Let me tell you, there is not that many of the offerings where the ram was given, but the guilt offering or the reparation offering or the trespass offering was one that says that they used a ram, okay? So in this particular instance, I think he's referring to, and we find out from the context, he kills the lamb in the place where he kills the sin offering and the burnt offering in a holy place. For as the sin offering is the priest, so is the trespass offering. And so he's referring to this killing of a lamb as being this trespass offering in Leviticus 14:13. And again, one of the reasons I did this review is I want us to be able to look at these things, and I want us to have triggers go off in our head. When I read and it says burnt offering, what is it talking about? What was done to it? Why was it given? How was it fulfilled in Christ? And those are the things that I want us to have going off in our minds, because again, what are we doing? We're taking the light of the New Testament, okay? We're taking the light from the book of Hebrews, we're bringing it back into this cave called Leviticus. And we're going to walk through and we're going to understand it in greater understanding. So when we read Leviticus, we're not walking around in darkness, hitting the wall or rocks, whatever. We're understanding what it is we're seeing. And that's what I want us to do. Another one, Numbers 5:8. But if the man has no relative to whom restitution may be made for the wrong, guess what restitution is? The word asam, for trespass offering. The restitution for the wrong, once again, asam, same one, for trespass offering, must go to the Lord for the priest, in addition to the ram of the atonement with which atonement is made for him. And now let me give you a lesser one. Proverbs 14:9, and I'm going to give you Bonar at the very end of the message, how Bonar translates Proverbs 14:9. But Proverbs 14:9, fools mock at sin. That word for sin, asam, trespass. Fools mock at trespassing. But among the upright, there is favor. What might we put that as? Fools mock at the trespass offering, but among the righteous, there is grace. And so, we are going to look at that later on. Gordon Wenham refers to this again as the reparation offering and makes this statement. Closer examination shows that the two sacrifices were quite distinct. The ritual was different. The sacrificial animals were different. The circumstances in which they were offered differed. The function of the reparation offering was not the same as that of the purification offering. In short, different names denote different sacrifices, insofar as other sacrifices also had to do with the guilt of sin. There is much to be said for calling this the reparation offering or the compensation offering to bring out its precise function. So I mentioned, where's Bonar? There he is. So Bonar says, many of the best writers, such as Outram, whom I do not know who Outram was, but if you know, you can educate me later on, come to no definite conclusion as to the difference between the sin offering and the trespass offering. I honestly appreciated the fact that Bonar admits this right up front, because I would have had the same thing. I might have thought, if you don't do the study, you might think, you know what? Nobody else caught this, but I did. And I'm catching the fact that these are really similar. Maybe they're actually the same. And I would have been wrong. All right. But we are satisfied on the whole the trespass offering was offered in cases where the sin was more private and confined to the individual's knowledge. He's the only person that's offering what I will call a definitive difference for the occasion of it. All right? Now, we're going to look at these occasions, and there's going to be 3 of them. There's going to be 3 different occasions of when this offering occurred. But he's saying that the primary difference was the public nature of it. That the sin offering was something that a person had done this publicly. Later on, they come to an understanding this was wrong, this was against God's law. Therefore, they repent of that, they confess that before God, and they bring a sin offering before God, a public item. Now, in the trespass offering, the reality is it was less about the nature of what had happened. That's part of it. It's more about what he gets at with that compensation, and you're going to see that because we have this comment in there about this, this weight of the shekels of silver, and you're going to actually see within there that basically there was a repayment made plus 20%. All right, so think back. If I stole something from somebody, what did the law require that I do? I pay back the amount I stole plus another amount, again, the whole amount that I stole. It's essentially 200%. In the trespass offering, it was a trespass. It was not a deception. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't something that was plotted out. But later on, I come to a realization I've done something and I've trespassed against another. What might we refer to that? The fact that I'm thinking about something now, I've done this wrong against another person. We might use the word guilt, which is one of those words to understand that word trespass. My conscience now is against me. My conscience is saying to me, I've broken a line, I've crossed a line. I've done that which was wrong. As a result, I need to go back and make it up. But I don't go back and I don't make it up just equal. I go back, I make it up, and I add 20% of value on. Showing what? showing the fact that truly I recognized I sinned against God, maybe against another too. It could have been solely against God himself. But I go back and I make that whole, I make that right by this offering. Now, Bonar goes through and makes the comment that the trespass offering was always a ram. And he felt that that in one of the instances there, that it would actually cause the Hebrews to think about Isaac and his substitution that was done by the ram. He made the comment, and I thought this was very interesting, that Ishmael would look at a ram and see nothing but an animal that one might use in a sacrifice, but that Isaac would look at a ram and see actually one that was a substitution for him. And I thought that was just kind of maybe stretching the outsides of something, but yet I think he actually really got also to the heart of something, of how a regenerate versus an unregenerate might view a sacrifice like that. Ishmael sees it as a means of something, and yet Isaac sees it as an actual personal. He was that ram became my substitute, and so he probably never looked at a ram the same way after that day. All right, moving along here. I gotta close down this. I got too many things open. Apologize here. So let's get back in here on why this offering. In Leviticus chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, we get the first instance of why this was required. All right? It was an unintentional sin against God in respect to things in his worship. But again, the sin was known. The sin was unknown. Hold on here. If a person commits a trespass, sins unintentionally, all right, he didn't mean to sin in regard to the holy things, then he shall bring to the Lord as his trespass an offering a ram without blemish from the flocks, with your valuation and shekels of silver according to the shekel of the sanctuary, as a trespass offering. So in this particular instance, he knew it was a known sin, but he did not intentionally sin against God. How did he sin against God? Somehow in relation to the property of the Lord. I think it's the NIV that says regarding the property of the Lord, something like that. It had to do something with the fact of the things pertaining to the Lord's temple, or the Lord's tabernacle in this particular instance. Bonar basically says that the first two that I'm going to give you have to deal with sins against God, and thereby they're sins against the first tablet of the law. All right? Ecclesiastes 5:6. And by the way, I do have sermon notes out there for those that do want to follow along. Those are available out there, because I know that sometimes I can jump a little bit. All right, Ecclesiastes 5:6. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? So in this text, a man made a vow to God, and he's later tempted to reduce what he promised to give to God. All right? Now, Gordon Wenham gives us this. Quite what constituted an inadvertent sin against the Lord's sacred property or holy things is not specified. Eating holy food is one possibility, and he gives an example, Leviticus 22:14. Perhaps failing to fulfill a dedicatory vow or to present the tithe would have also constituted an offering meriting a reparation offering. So a person says, I'm going to do this for God, but later on they don't go back and do it. Now, who knew about that? Nobody, perhaps. Maybe just that person alone. But what happens? The work of the Spirit comes upon, begins to plague that person's conscience. They know they promised before God they would do something, and they believed that God indeed was behind that. But now, for whatever reason, they've gone back on that. This is what he is saying. Notice that the penalty is in two parts. The man has to restore to the priesthood that of which they have been deprived by his, and he uses the word mistake, plus 20%. he must also bring a ram to be slain at the altar. So I think we don't naturally get that right away from reading the text, but he's saying you restore in value what you deprived the Lord of. All right? So that, in a sense, makes the vow whole. But I sinned against God. I kept back from God what I should have done. And he says, on top of that, you bring the ram. Now, the ram becomes that atoning sacrifice. The repayment is not an atoning sacrifice. The repayment is actually giving to God what originally a person said they were going to do for God. But the ram becomes that atoning element there. And then once again, could that ram atone that person of their sins themselves? No. Christ actually accomplished that. Did that ram picture what Christ was going to accomplish? Absolutely. Moving on. In Leviticus 5:17 through 19, we get the second instance. So we're moving pretty rapidly here. An unintentional sin against God in respect to things in worship. In this case, the sin was unknown, but the guilt is there. And Wenham distinguishes this by the man's conscience condemning him. Look at verse 17. If a person sins and commits any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he does not know it, that parenthetical comma there is really important. He does not know it, yet he is guilty, and shall bear his iniquity. And he shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, with your evaluation as a trespass offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him regarding his ignorance in which he erred and did not know it, and it shall be forgiven him. It is a trespass offering. He has certainly trespassed against the Lord. Wenham states, someone suspects he has sinned, but he does not know exactly how. In his uncertainty, he fears the worst, and therefore a reparation offering must be brought, a ram or its equivalent in money in this particular case. So in the first case, it was the value plus the ram. In this case, it's a ram or its equivalent in money. He doesn't know for sure that he actually did something, but his conscience is actually against him in this matter. The gravity of sin dealt with by the reparation offering is demonstrated by the fact that unlike the burnt and purification offerings, less valuable animals than rams could be brought instead. However, since the sin was only suspected, not known, there was no restitution of sacred property involved. So I'm going to stick with what Wenham says here. I think he's making a distinction based off the text that is kind of maybe hard for us to catch right away at a cursory reading, but I think that that distinction is important. I think it is a separate distinction, and that is number 2. There's a third instance, and that is fraud towards another person, or fraud towards man. And this is a sin against that second table of the law. Wenham notes that as in the sin against God that the worshiper had to compensate the man he offended by giving him back what he lost, and had to acknowledge his guilt before God by bringing the sacrificial lamb. So if it was a sin against another person, once again, restore the value plus 20% and bring a sacrificial ram or lamb here to be that atoning sacrifice for you. The sin dealt with here is not merely stealing another's goods, either by blatant robbery, extortion, or by failing to return property entrusted for safekeeping. But when challenged about this swearing falsely, that is not guilty. So what would happen here is a person would say, I lent you my cow. And now you are saying, you didn't lend me your cow. And so how would they settle this agreement? Well, they would bring it before the courts of the day. What was pretty common in that day was a person would take an oath. And they would say, by the Lord who lives, they may say, I did not take your cow. Or, by the Lord who lives, you gave me the cow. Later on, this person is under a guilty conscience. What they did. And perhaps what's happened, and Wenham and some others said, perhaps what happens is the Lord begins to actually show his wrath. Perhaps the Lord begins to cause this person now to experience hardship and trouble, and their conscience gets pricked. What I did was a sin against another because I defrauded another of property. What I also did was a sin against God. For when I was confronted by it, I denied it. And in fact, in that day, I even took an oath against the name of the Lord that I did not do it. And therefore, this reparation has two sides to it. One side is I go back to that neighbor. I restore to that person that property plus 20%. And now I come to the Lord with that ram as my atoning sacrifice because I sinned against God. And I think one of the things this really shows us is that no sin against man is solely a sin against man. Every sin against man really also is a sin against God. And I think that is not that we are making man into a god, don't get me wrong, but that we have also broken what? That second tablet of the law. Think about that second tablet of the law. You know, in every one of these things here, and Christ gives us the proper understanding of these different things. And he says, yeah, it's not just about adultery, it's against lust and all these other things. Every sin against a person, every one of those sins in that second tablet was against a person. But it was also against God. And we sometimes want to bifurcate that. And we sometimes want to put a division here. And we want to say, well, I just did this, but, you know, I'm okay with God, though I'm not okay with this person. And that's not the case. So what was the liturgy of this offering? The trespass offering was always a ram or a male lamb, chapter 5, verse 15. And this, again, will remind us of really Abraham's offering in the case of Isaac, where the ram was substituted. I believe this is from Wenham. He said rams and male lambs could be offered as burnt offerings and peace offerings, but other animals could be used too. On the other hand, male sheep were never allowed for the purification offering. That's the sin offering. Bulls, goats, female lambs, and birds could be offering, but not rams and male lambs. So there was a difference in that trespass offering from the sin offering, that the animals of the trespass offering were never used in the sin offering. They were always a different animal. And that was one of those distinctions between the two, was the animals that were used. He says the choice of animals is the first clear distinction between the purification offering and the reparation offering. So again, there was less detail here than the other sacrifices. Think back to the first couple of them. You know, it would talk about how the guy would bring the animal there, he'd lean on the animal, he'd basically cut the animal's neck. The priest is there grabbing the blood, carrying the blood back, throwing it against the sides of the altar or draining it over the altar, and you know, it was a bloody occasion. And this one, we don't have all that liturgy. What we do know is one thing. The blood was thrown against the side of the altar. That is what we know for sure. The worshiper brought this unblemished ram to the altar of burnt offering, and as with the other sacrifices, it was killed there. Now, one of the things in the ritual here was the valuation in shekels of silver. I have to admit, when I read that, I thought back to our dear friend Mr. Heisinger, who always referred to about a shekel. And so my mind kept going to Don Heisinger again and again. It says, it does not explicitly say the worshiper laid his head on the animal. Now, Numbers 5:7 mentions confession as part of the rite. And laying on the hands was usually accomplished along with confession. What you're really saying is this animal is bearing the effects that my sin should have upon me. And that's what would happen again and again. And it wasn't just a laying on of hands, it was like a leaning. They leaned on the animal with their weight, saying, this animal is identified with me. What's happening to that animal is what should happen to me. So it's very, very likely that that happened here. It's not explicitly stated in Leviticus at this point that that was the case. The blood was always put on the sides of the altar. Think back to the sin offering. Where was it applied? To the horns. In this particular instance, the blood goes to the side of the altar. That distinction alone would be enough for me. In the sin offering, the priest would take the blood and he'd put it on the horns of the altar. And this one here, he took the blood and he splashed it on the sides of the altar. And so, again, there was a difference there. The fat and the entrails of the ram are burned on the altar. And then the priests are allowed to have the flesh to cook and to eat. In allocating the meat to the priest, the reparation offering resembled the purification offering of the leader or the layman there. So there was a similarity. And most Jews, when they would explain this estimation of value, this shekels of silver, let me give you what the Jews said. Traditional Jewish explanation is that the ram must be worth at least 2 shekels. That's one possible estimation. The ram had to be worth 2 shekels. Another explanation was that the person could bring a ram or the equivalent in silver. So, in theory, you're bringing the value of the ram as opposed to the ram itself. But what was really key to this offering in every one of the instances was that the value was restored plus 20%. Value plus 20%. So what is the New Testament perspective, or how do we understand all this? You say, man, Mike, you took me deep into that cave. It was dark and I hit a couple of rocks. Number one, the Gospels underline how Christ was scourged. And think back to that. Here he is at the scourging. Accusations are made against him, right? They go unanswered at the trial. He was crucified with robbers, buried in a rich man's grave. All these are allusions to Isaiah chapter 53. And when Isaiah 53 is being fulfilled in the Lord, we see this in Matthew 8:17, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. So Christ was the perfect burnt offering. He was the perfect peace offering, of which I have a memorial in the Lord's table. He was the perfect purification offering. He gave me all his righteousness. He took upon all my sin. So I have no sin remaining, and yet I've also fulfilled the law of God. But he's also the perfect reparation offering. The sacrifice compensated God, in a sense, for our sin. His sacrifice paid the payment. His sacrifice, we use that word redeemed. What does that mean? To buy back. So his sacrifice paid the offense. It accomplished in full plus measure above all that I had committed against God. And therefore, am I somehow bound to a reparation offering today? And the answer to that will be no. It's all been fulfilled in Christ. Now, does that mean that I don't have this opportunity through tithes and offerings and gifts that I can give to God? That I can go and be gracious in that giving? Absolutely. As with the other sacrifices, it's hard to understand how a transaction like this can be applied to God, especially in the members of the Godhead. We must not make that too far of a distinction, as if the Father is demanding something and the Son is somehow frantically trying to pay this for us. It was all ordained and fulfilled in full by the persons of the Godhead. Christ's death is the perfect reparation offering. He has therefore made the reparation offering obsolete along with other sacrifices. It's not any longer necessary to compensate God for our failure by bringing a lamb or a ram to the altar. Our spiritual debts have been paid fully by the person and the work of Jesus Christ. But as I mentioned before, what does this offering teach us? All sin is against God, even when we sin against another person. The reparation offering focuses on the debt we incur to God by breaking his law, by breaking his commands. And I think Bonar, in his allocating those different occasions to the tablets of the law, hit on the heart of the reparation offering. I have sinned against God on either side of the tablet, even when I'm sinned against man. Why? Because it's God's law who prescribes how I deal with man. Matthew 5:23 and 24, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, go your way, first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. What was he saying? Do not keep occasions of offense, occasions of hardness against one another. In the disciples' prayer, or what people call as the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:12, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It could be understood, and in fact is translated in the King James as trespasses. It's a reference back to the trespass offering. And in the New King James, they take that and say debt. And that's what the trespass offering was showing, was a debt. All right. Luke 19:8 and 9. Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. What was Zacchaeus doing? He was saying, if I have trespassed against, number one, I'm giving this offering to God as a trespass offering, for I know I've sinned against God. But if I've sinned against others, I'm actually going to restore it fourfold. I'm actually going to go above the requirement of the Levitical law, and I'm going to go so far beyond that. I'm showing I truly have turned from my sin. I have repented from my sin. What was the Lord's response? Today salvation has come to this house because he is also a son of Abraham. I mean, this guy Zacchaeus was absolutely hated. And yet here the Lord says, yes, you are actually demonstrating fruits of righteousness. You're actually demonstrating the result of the gospel. Today, salvation's come. So, how might we understand the trespass offering? Here's my little one sentence. The trespass offering shows the true price of sin against man and God. The trespass offering shows the true price of sin against man and God. And I got 4 statements here on how this should change our lives. Number 1, how conscious am I of my sin against both man and God? I said before, if you are sinning against man, you are sinning against God. Do not excuse your sin and believe you have no spiritual impact. All right? If you offend another in a wrong, because of something wrong, because of your sin, frankly, let's just be honest, you offend another person, it is a sin against them and a sin against God. Do not excuse it for anything less. Do not think, well, I can have aught against another, and yet I'm okay with God. Your spiritual life is not bifurcated that way. That's number 1. Number 2, Do I recognize the debt paid by Christ? There was payment not only of the loss, but also of the addition of more. And you cannot buy forgiveness from God. Jesus has paid it all with interest. Do not think that somehow Jesus just made it all level. He went over and above. He paid for your trespasses plus. Number 3. This speaks to honesty towards God and man. Defrauding people of something by intention or not is to be taken seriously. It is a sin against God. So this comes back to our relationships with one another. Defrauding another, whatever that may be, but intentionally defrauding another is sin against God as well as sin against man. And number 4, Bonar says, this is the true sense of Proverbs 14:9, when properly rendered. Fools make a mock of the trespass offering, but with the righteous it is in esteem, is how Bonar puts it. That trespass offering, that was the 5th. It's the one, we tend to start dealing with these things in order of magnitude, like the first one's the most important. And yet, Bonar would say, by that word of, in Proverbs 14:9, translated sin, which is the same psalm used for a trespass offering, he says, fools make a mock of the trespass offering. As in the fact that payment to God of what I owe and payment to others and defrauding God or defrauding others is not a serious matter. And he says that is the characteristic of a fool. Now we know from the book of Proverbs, the fool, where is his end? It's hell. It's destruction. And so he shows us with that statement alone in Proverbs 14:9 the absolute seriousness of the trespass offering. But with the righteous it is in esteem, or it is held high. Once again, the trespass offering shows the true price of sin against man and God. I want to close with the benediction differently here. I'm going to refer to a verse, but I want to read a statement by Andrew Bonar in his commentary as he's closing out. He said, the godly cherished these typical delineations of atonement, while the careless, earthly-minded Israelite saw nothing in them to desire. None go to the hiding place who fear no storm. The stream flows by unheeded when the traveler on its banks is not thirsty. The whole will not use the physician. Sense of sin renders Jesus precious to the soul. How Peter loved the risen Savior when who relieved him of the load of his denial. A sight of wrath to come gives a new aspect to every spiritual thing. In Egypt, a sight of the destroying angel's sword would make Israel prize the blood. Ishmael might have mocked at the ram caught in the thicket, but not so Isaac, who had been bound with the cords of death. It is only fools that will mock at the trespass offering. With the righteous, it is held in unspeakable esteem. Their song is, thanks be unto God for his unspeakable gift. And the Lord add his own blessing to the preaching of his word today. Amen.